I want to start out with a confession. It's not that different from Leslie's confession. I am the parent of an adolescent. We would, my son and I, describe him as in the stage of late adolescence, and I will qualify that for you in just a moment. About 2 to 3 weeks ago, I was in Costa Rica, where my son and his other adolescent friends were attending the Envision Festival. If you haven't heard of this festival in Costa Rica, I'll describe it as a younger version of Burning Man in the United States. There is music, there is dance, there is yoga, meditation, there is a lot of love. And what was really wonderful about this experience is it just reminded me why I love studying this time and why it's just such a wonderful, wonderful developmental period, although some of you in the audience may say, really? This is a wonderful time. But in part, it's because as my son and his friends would come back and occasionally get a shower at the house where I was staying, you would just hear the enthusiasm and the excitement, the highest highs in terms of having seen some structure with all these flashing lights and the music that was playing at 2 a.m. in the morning when I was gratefully sleeping, or would describe how they were doing yoga at sunset on the Pacific Ocean. And then they would also describe the lowest lows, when they'd lost a member of the group that had decided to attend the Envision Festival, but then were able to find them again. But the emotions that they expressed during that time. And when the tent that they were staying in completely got washed out almost to the ocean when there was a rainstorm. And so these highs and these intense experiences, almost like a roller coaster ride, are why I love this period, but it's also why many of you, myself included, do not want to re-experience our adolescence necessarily. But with intense experiences, we learn, and we can learn rapidly, and we can learn from our responses to these experiences, and we can learn about the outcomes. And that helps to shape what the limitations and the boundaries are. So it would be important to have intense responses to our environment during this time. Now I want to say one more thing about this period, and that is it gets a really bad rap. And I apologize for my title. Even putting the phrase half-baked is perhaps not being generous to adolescents. When a teenager makes a bad decision in the heat of the moment, we call it deviant often. We compare their brain to that of a defective car, suggesting that it has no brakes and no steering wheel, only an accelerator. But we really don't use this description and for other developmental stages. So when an infant on day 1 cannot walk or talk, we don't call that deviant. In fact, it would be weird, odd, if they could. But we call it development. We don't call it defective. Now, I think it's actually fair for us to psychopathologize adolescents for a number of reasons, particularly as scientists. And that is, it's during this time that we see so many mental health problems emerge. There are prevalence statistics that suggest as many as 1 in 5. Some suggest as many as 1 in 4 youth experience mental health problems. And in this graph, what you can see, if we collapse across all the mental health problems, the average age in which they're emerging and peaking is right around this mid-teen interval of time. So many scientists have really focused on this aspect because they want to understand how the brain is changing during this time that may give rise to psychopathology. And there have been many advances in imaging technology now where we can look at the structure, we can look at the connections, and we can look at the function of the brain and begin to gain insights as to why the adolescent experiences the world the way they do, how they respond to it, and when that response, those emotions, are typical and when they're atypical, and when we might want to intervene or even treat. Now, with the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging, we really have been able as adults, and I know there's some teenagers in the crowd too, but we can just open up your brain and look inside, and while you're making a risky decision, we can see how the brain circuitry is responding in that moment when you're making a choice that could be risky, when you're making a choice in the presence of a peer. I also like to present this slide because this was my son when he was 12, and he made it into nature before I did. He takes great pride in that, as any adolescent would. So let me just quickly define adolescence, and then we'll start to talk about what we've learned from behavioral science and also brain science in terms of why this period of development is so special. And first, I just want to operationally define it as this is the developmental phase in which we learn how to be an adult. We move from really relying on our caregivers to trying to learn how to be independent from them. And the onset we typically describe is around puberty. The offset, this is where it comes back to if my son is out of adolescence yet. If the definition of adolescence is to learn to be independent from the caregiver, my son informed me financially, he might be an adolescent for a bit longer. He's in his 20s, almost mid-20s. So there is just a little bit more information I want to provide here, and that is how we've learned to characterize adolescence from the work that we've done, because too often we've thought about development as being a child is a little adolescent and an adolescent is a little adult. And I hope after this evening you'll recognize that they're very different from both an adult and a child in very unique ways. And that may explain some of the behaviors that we see them engage in. They are specifically very responsive or show a heightened response to rewards, to threats, and also to social influences that of peers. And in the absence of these social and emotional factors, I would argue that adolescents are as good, if not better, at a number of cognitive tasks. And we can just look at data from about 1,000 participants from the ages of 10 to 30 and look to see when cognitive capacities or abilities begin to mature. And if you look at this plot, we're seeing that cognitive abilities are maturing in this mid-teen period. Now, how do we measure this type of cognitive ability? I would give you 7 digits or the equivalent of a phone number, which millennials in the audience, I'm not even sure how many of us can remember but one phone number these days because everything is coded into our phone. But we ask individuals, after we give them a series of numbers, to repeat them back to us, but in backwards order. So if it would be 9 numbers, that would get difficult. If it were 4, I can do 1, 2, 3, 4, and in front of you I can say 4, 3, 2, 1, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that. Another task that we use that's part of this composite is seeing just how well you can inhibit or suppress competing information. So if I were to ask you to think of all the words you can possibly think of that begin with a letter, let's take the letter F. Just if you want to, you can blurt out and play this game with me. The first few words that come to mind that start with the letter F are fun, fantastic. And they keep coming. But as these words, you keep generating them, then what happens is all the words that you've just generated, they start to interfere with you thinking of new ones. So, I mean, I'm still back on thinking fun, funny. So this is a measure where we can look at cognitive capacity too. And so when you take those together, this is what we're seeing is maturing around the mid-teen years. But the minute we add social information, all bets are off. So let me just provide an example of this. We can simply ask a teenager, when they see a positive social cue, a smiling face, it's going to appear rarely, but when it does, do not attend, do not respond to this particular picture. We then look to see how well teens, children, and adults can perform this task. And we have a control condition where there's no real positive or emotional information. It's just a neutral face. And teens cannot help themselves. You have told them not to go, but it's when it's positive, smiling face, just like sometimes when you're giving a talk and you see a smile in the audience, you tend to orient to that face. Teenagers have a very difficult time not reacting. And again, we've controlled, we're not saying that teenagers are less impulsive than children. What we're saying is when you get social or emotional cues and you add them, that's when they have the specific impulsivity that we see. Now, adolescence isn't all fun and games. It's not all positive. So we can also look at cues of particular emotions, such as cues of threat. Now, I don't think that you're afraid of this particular face, but when you see those faces or someone elicits that face and you see it, there's this uncertainty of something, there may be some potential danger. So these are cues of potential danger from peers. And if we look at performance again, they're not supposed to respond to these. What do teens do? Do they avoid them? No. It's as if they're drawn to danger. They're pulled right in, and we find that they're particularly impulsive in these situations. My good friend and colleague, Larry Steinberg, has also shown that just having a peer next to you can impact your performance. And he's got this beautiful game that if you drive, we've all played, and that is, do you or don't you go through the yellow light? And many of us go through that yellow light when maybe we shouldn't, but for certain reasons. But the beauty of this paradigm was that Steinberg examined how teenagers did relative to college-age individuals and also adults when they played this game when they were by themselves and when they played it when a friend was with them. And so I'm going to show you performance when they're making risky decisions in this game, when they're alone, or when they even end up crashing because they've gone through the yellow light too late. And so the blue bars that I'm about to show you will be just when they're performing alone, and the red will be when they're with a peer. And I hope what you can see from this graph is that teens do really well when they're alone, even though they're not practice drivers. But the minute you put them with a peer, that's when they start to make these risky decisions and poor performance. There's another task I just want to share because too often those of us that work on the period of adolescence get accused of creating this in Western civilization. And so just to provide an example of a study where we look at the effects of peers, even in mice, and I did not believe the study was going to work, but basically they examined whether or not juvenile mice, when they were peers, would they drink more than adult mice when they were with cage mates. And they went to great care to make sure that the animals all got along well. And sure enough, what you're seeing in the blue bars are the juveniles, and when a juvenile is with a peer, it's spending much more time at the nozzle drinking the alcohol. So at a time when the cognitive ability of teens is really at a mature state, is also the time in which we're seeing real changes in emotional and social maturity. So here's an example of when those skills, again in about 1,000 participants, when those develop, and what you might notice is it's about the age of my son, 20, in the mid-20s, almost up to 25. And so when they perform games such as the yellow light game, or if you ask them about risk preferences, we see that they make more errors, and it begins to level off in the mid-20s. So now what you can do is you can look at really both of these plots in cognitive development and social-emotional development, and it's what has been referred to as a maturity gap. And if you look around the world and you use these measures in India, Colombia, in China, United States, and in different countries in Europe, you see the same pattern. So now I just want to turn and talk a little bit about how these psychological development is paralleled by what we're seeing in the brain. And really a question for a number of developmental neuroscientists has been, is there some neural signature of when the brain is mature? That kind of gives me a visceral reaction because maturity sounds like a stable state, and I think of the brain as being so plastic. With every new bit of information that you learn and take in, the brain is changing. But we can still get a general idea when it's begun, those functional changes are beginning to level off. So I first just want to talk about structural changes that we're seeing in the brain. And this is just looking at the outside, sort of the cortex of the brain. You have a side view. And this movie will wrap around, but as you see areas turn blue, that is when the brain is reaching cortical thickness. And you're watching this from 5 to about 20 years of age. Let me show you a static picture, because I think it's a little bit more helpful. And let's just focus on the bottom part. So by 5, 6, 7, we're already seeing that blue area, or peak cortical thickness, in visual, sensory, and motor areas. But it's not until we're emerging into the 20s, and you can still see changes in the front part of the brain, and this is the prefrontal cortex, where it's continuing to change. It would make sense that systems that allow us to see and to recognize objects and people would develop, as well as our ability to move toward them or interact with them, before areas of the brain that have been associated with considering the future consequences of our actions. So some people have described the prefrontal cortex as a time machine. It's an area where it's getting information from different areas of the brain that allow it to think about what were the outcomes of previous actions and think about what the outcomes will be from a decision in the moment. What will the future hold for them if they make that particular decision? Now, this is just the cortex. Don't want you to think that we're cortical chauvinists, and that's the only area of the brain that we're going to look at. And when we talk about adolescence, we don't really think about control necessarily. So this is a glass brain, and the area where you're seeing green and blue are areas that have been implicated in desire and rage and fear and the fight and flight response. And we're seeing changes in these regions that are subtle, and they begin to level off by the late teen years, while the prefrontal cortex, you're seeing areas in fuchsia are continuing to change. And this sort of imbalance in the development between what I'll refer to, for the sake of simplicity, emotional systems versus more control, regions that are rational, thinking about the consequences of our action, can also be examined from a functional standpoint. So we can look inside the brain and see how these regions are changing when teenagers are making certain decisions or they're experiencing many different things. And let's first just start off with rewards. And if you ask a teenager what is rewarding, there are teens in the audience, anything that's rewarding? Any teens want to volunteer? Is money rewarding? So if you have the opportunity to play a game and you can win money, what this landmark study by Adriana Galvan, who was a graduate student at Weill Cornell, when I had my lab here, she actually showed that adolescents have this heightened response in reward-related areas of the brain, and you don't see that in either children or adults. And you see, as we've talked about, with the prefrontal cortex is gradually changing. It's gradually changing, but there's nothing special about adolescence. These data call into question what colleagues, when we first got involved in this research, were saying. It really calls them into question because they would say, teenagers don't have a prefrontal cortex, therefore they can't make rational, reasonable decisions. And what this study shows is it's not all about the prefrontal cortex. It's about different circuitry in the brain, and they're all communicating with one another, but we're seeing something very specific in these deep, primitive limbic systems. Now, let me just make that a little bit more concrete. If we think about the behavior of teens, sometimes we think of them as being riskier. The magnitude of the response in receipt of reward is correlated with the likelihood of engaging in risky behaviors. So that makes it a bit more concrete in terms of their behavior. But remember those smiling social cues that I was telling you about before? When you present those social cues to the adolescent, you see the same pattern as what we saw with monetary reward. When you look to see when a teenager goes through the yellow light and it results in a crash and they make that decision when a peer is present, you see the same area that's activated. And so this has led several of us to begin to think about how the brain is communicating. And during adolescence, what we think are these deep primitive regions, the circuitry, changes in neurotransmitters, neuromodulators are happening in this circuitry before they are in the prefrontal cortex. So if you're making a decision in an emotional situation, that system may win out and hijack this prefrontal control system. Now, I've been talking about what teens are doing, and we can look at the functional activity, but I could put each one of you in an MRI, ask you to do absolutely nothing, just rest, and you can see baseline brain activity. And we can look to see what areas of the brain, when you're just in a neutral, relaxed state, are co-activating. And we can create what we've been referring to as a functional connectome. The functional connectome is like a fingerprint. Each one of you has a unique one. And the fingerprint is really a result of your unique experiences and the genetics and any biological predispositions that you bring to the world, and then how you adapt to that world. And as we look across development, what we're discovering is that functional connectome is becoming more and more distinct as with maturation and the unique experiences that we each have. And we can take this functional connectome and ask, and it's a big ask, can we create a maturational index that's like what we see now in a pediatrician's office, where we can measure height and weight? It's a little bit more complicated when we look at a functional connectome because everything's not really linear. We have many different regions changing throughout development. This just illustrates the complexity. And what I'm showing is anywhere that you're seeing orange, for some of you in the back, it might look a little bit more like a Monet, but orange is where connections are strengthening, and the green is where connections are weakening across a number of networks in the brain. But you can take this information and look at regularities across age and ask, can I predict the true age of an individual just based on their functional connectome? And you can get an idea. You can at least, I would say, distinguish a child from an adult. So this is just the beginning of where people are trying to begin to assess not only the maturity of the brain, but the reason for doing this is to look at outliers so we can see when there's a deviation that might be informative in terms of intervention or treatment. But as I mentioned, you don't have to do anything, and we can take pictures of your brain. If we really want to understand its maturity, we want to know how it is maturing and can function in emotional settings. So we can stress the brain just like you would stress the heart when you visit the cardiologist. And if we're going to stress the teen brain, then we probably want to put them back into those states like my son and his friends were experiencing in Envision. I'm not sure they can experience everything that they experienced at Envision. I don't really want to know everything that they experienced at Envision. My mother always said, you want to know about a quarter of what your child is really doing, and those are the serious ones that you really want to target, maybe a half. So we can use different manipulations to try to put them in emotionally aroused states, and they can be positive or negative. Two of the states arousal conditions we've used are, I was talking about money before. We tell an individual we don't know when, we don't know if, but you could possibly win $100. And we wave a $100 bill in front of them before we put them in the scanner. And then in another situation, they hear this loud aversive sound, and you get a skin conductance response. They actually sweat, an indication of arousal, and they rate it as terribly aversive. And we say, we don't know how loud, we don't know when or if, but this could happen during this situation. Now, what my colleagues and I wanted to do is to see, under these different arousal states, if we could predict the true age of an individual. And so we use computations and machine learning where you're just looking at structure and the functional connections in the brain. And so first, we have an independent sample of individuals where we have their functional imaging data, and we see if we can look at regularities in their connections to predict what age they are in a neutral state. And what I'm showing you here is we can come up with a model that does a pretty good job predicting the age of an individual in a neutral state, just as I showed you before in an earlier publication from Science. But now the question is, can we take that model? You can overfit a model, but can we take that model and use it in a completely different group of individuals and predict their age? That's when the model is informative. And can we predict their age when they're in a positive or negative state and neutral state? And what our data are showing us is that you can do a pretty good job in predicting the true age of an individual when they're in a neutral state, but when they're in a negative or a positively arousing state, we're not doing as well. Now, my colleagues love to have the perfect model. And they don't like it when I say, but this is the interesting part. When your model fails, that tells us something special about how we can't predict true age. So I want to see where it's failing. So when we look to see exactly where the model can't predict age, we see that during the teen years, in these emotional states, the model is predicting their brain to be immature and not as old as they actually are. So how does a change in the functional connections when you're in a different arousal state impact your behavior? Is it the case that these emotional states actually impact our cognitive abilities, just as I was showing you in earlier studies? But in the earlier studies that I presented, we had children, teens, and then adults were anywhere from 18 to 35. So let's break that up and just look at 18 to 21-year-olds as a special category of adolescents, and also look at teens and then compare them to adults at least 21 or older. And we can look at some of the same manipulations. How do they perform when they're supposed to inhibit attention or responses to a positive social cue? How do they perform when there is a cue of potential threat? How do they perform when they're anticipating something good happen, like $100 winning? And I'm not going to play the sound for you because it's quite aversive, but how do you perform when you think at any moment you're going to hear this aversive sound and there's not anything that you can do to control it and it has nothing to do with your performance? And I just want to give you the punchline of this study because there are two real conditions that are showing significant differences in the performance of young adults relative to the older group. And these are the threat situations. When you see cues of potential threat, or if you are in a condition where you think you're going to hear this aversive sound, what we observe is that 18 to 21-year-olds, just like teens, are significantly diminished in their ability to perform a cognitive task, to stop themselves even though they've been instructed, or if in their emotional state, you also see that they're performing less well than the adult. And if we turn and we look inside the brain to see how it's behaving in these conditions, now when they're engaged in a task, what we observe in these lateral prefrontal control regions and circuits, we're seeing less activity in these regions in the young adults and teens relative to adults. And what we're seeing instead is they're really activating more limbic emotional circuits of the brain. So what the brain and the behavioral sciences are telling us is that cognitive processes are developing early, but when you superimpose these social-emotional conditions and situations that they get in, all bets are off, and we're actually seeing a more protracted, later maturation of these skills. So a question that I've had in much of my research is why? Why would the brain be programmed this way, to be so susceptible to peer and social cues and rewards? Well, adolescence, this is a time in which you need to learn social status, in part for survival, but also for reproduction. So it would make sense if there was a real sensitivity during this time where you could pick up potential threats in the environment for survival, as well as potential positive cues in the environment in terms of ultimate mate and also for survival as well. And so we think that that is one aspect of, or one reason for why we're seeing this sensitization in these social-emotional influences within brain and behavior. And so I'd like to suggest, even though we phrased it as, is the brain when is it well done? I would say that it's been sculpted in a way that is very well done to prepare the adolescent to meet the many different challenges that they face without the buffer of the parent, and also in a way that helps the survival of the human species. So I'd just like to end by actually acknowledging my son, who has, this is before they went to the last night of the Envision Festival. There he is. Yeah, I wasn't really sure about the outfits. They said they were, I don't even know, it's not cray-cray anymore, dope, I'm not sure what the word is. But he has provided for me this really wonderful, unique lens through which I have seen the amazing challenges and the amazing discoveries, and also just how adaptive the adolescent period is. And I also just want to end by acknowledging my good friend and colleague, Bruce McEwen. As I said, he was an enthusiastic scientist and was incredibly generative. I don't know how many generations, really, of scientists he has guided and advised over the years, but I consider one that was very lucky to have him in my career in life. Thank you.